for young people, is there a way that you can kind of describe the history and
allowing for various differences because no two historical situations are the same. I don't believe it's significantly different, the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians in general, and the conquest of the conquest of the North American continent, the displacement of the indigenous population, the resistance of the indigenous population. Sometimes the resistance was very brutal. And obviously, in the course of the displacement of the indigenous population in the US, very brutal tactics were resorted to. And I don't believe that it's fundamentally different in the case of Israel and the Palestinians. You could say that Jews had suffered very significant oppression, and maybe that can justify their aspiration to creating a state of their own based on the conclusion that they wouldn't be accepted anywhere else. And there's an argument there. I don't believe the argument carries the day, but there is an argument. And you can also say that a lot of those who came over to the United States would also say they were fleeing all sorts of persecution. But the fundamental fact is, and here I'll quote Israel's chief historian, Benny Morris. If you look at his books, he makes two claims, which, in my opinion, are equally applicable to the situation in the United States. Claim number one, and now I'm quoting him, is, quote, the fear of territorial dispossession and displacement was the chief motor of Arab antagonism to Zionism. And I would say that's equally valid for the chief motor of Native American resistance to the Euro-American conquest of North America, namely the fear of territorial dispossession and territorial displacement. Now, some might argue, well, maybe they feared it, but that's an irrational fear. But then Benny Morris goes on to say in another one of his books, he said the idea of transfer, that's the euphemism for ethnic cleansing, the idea of transfer was inevitable and inbuilt in Zionism. That in order to realize a state, create a state that was overwhelmingly Jewish in an area that was overwhelmingly non-Jewish, namely Arab Muslim and Arab Christian, the only way to create that Jewish state was through transfer, expulsion, ethnic cleansing. And it was basically the same in the United States. The United States wanted to create a white state. There was no place for non-whites, be it the native population or the African American population. There was no place for equality of status between whites and non-whites. If you take a case like the Cherokee Indians were, they adopted all white, so to speak, all white ways. They created a written language. They had private property. They were so white that they had slaves. They supported the Confederacy during the Civil War. But that didn't prevent the fact that being not white physically, it didn't prevent their periodic displacement and dispossession. They started off on the East Coast, then they were pushed to North Carolina and Mississippi, and then they were in the Trail of Tears. They were then expelled to Arkansas, and then in Arkansas, they were expelled to a little corner of Arkansas. And when the whites population predominated over the Cherokees by roughly 10-1, then they created the state of Oklahoma. So whatever the Cherokee did, there was no way they could, or the Native Americans in general, there was no way they could escape the fate of territorial displacement and dispossession. I think that's basically what happened with the population in the indigenous population in Palestine.
Can you talk again briefly just about the current situation?
Israel occupies densely populated Arab areas. They're known as the West Bank and Gaza. Israel, like our own North American conquerors of the wilderness, as it was called back then, they wanted the land, but they didn't want the people. The problem is they don't know how to get, in the case of Israel now, they don't know how to get rid of the people. And so they're keeping hold of the land, the West Bank and Gaza. However, they're not granting any rights to the population. So it's a de facto, you could call it a de facto, I don't want to use the word slave population, but let's say a de facto rightless population. They have no rights. They don't have the right to vote. They don't have the right to go to court. They don't have any rights whatsoever. And systematically, they're being deprived of their land in the West Bank. In the case of Gaza, Israel adopted a different approach, which is they simply sealed it off. They sealed Gaza off from the outside world. No one can go in, nobody can go out. They don't let you export anything, and they have very severe limits on imports. Like you can't import cement to build homes or build factories or build really anything. So in the case of the West Bank, Israel is slowly but surely, the fancy word is incrementally, slowly but surely dispossessing the population of the land while it deprives the population of any basic rights, which most people in the US and in large parts of the world, basic rights that are taken for granted, beginning, of course, with the right to vote. And in the case of Gaza, it's basically leaving a population, in this case, 2.1 million people, half of whom are children, leaving them with no future except to languish and die in what Israelis call a concentration camp.
What would you say is the biggest misconception on the Israeli-Palestinian history?
The biggest misconception is the same one I grew up with. And I came from an enlightened home. But I'll tell you, as a child, I watched a lot of television. I'm not proud of it, but it's a fact, and we shouldn't deny facts. I watched a lot of television. And I loved the cowboy and Indian programs, the movies, the weekly TV shows. I watched them all. And when I watched them, I'm telling you the honest to God truth, I hated the Indians. And they weren't called Indians, they were called savages. I hated them. I would watch the movie, and I remember one movie in particular where the settlers, uh, the Jim Bowies, the Davy Crockett's, the Daniel Boones. I remember in one of them, they took balls of fire they made, I think, from hay, and they hurled them on the teepees of the Indians or savages and incinerated the Indians and savages. And I was cheering. I was exhilarated. As a kid, we watched the famous movie, Remember the Alamo. It was a Walt Disney film. And in the Alamo were all the great heroes of the West. Jim Bowie was there. Daniel Boone, I think, was there. Lieutenant Rip Travers was there. And I hated Santa Anna. I hated the Mexicans. Look what they did to those poor, heroic cowboy figures for me. I didn't know, you live in a different era until the 1970s, as a consequence of the Cultural Revolution our country underwent in the 1960s. The very first film that depicted Native Americans in a positive light, it was called Little Big Men, and it starred Dustin Hoffman. And that in itself was a cultural revolution. I suddenly realized I was rooting for the wrong side. I didn't know that those folks in the Alamo were trying to steal Texas from Mexico. I thought Mexico was trying to steal Texas from us. So when you ask what's the biggest misconception in our understanding of the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's the same misconception that all Americans suffered until the 1970s. By the 1970s, I was already 20 years old. I mean, I'm not talking about a 5-year-old in front of the TV set. It was only at that point that I realized we were stealing their land. They weren't stealing our land. We were stealing their country in the case of Texas, not vice versa. And I think the biggest misconception is, in the grand scheme of things, the big picture, who is the victim and who is the perpetrator? That's the misconception.
What is one of the biggest misconceptions on the current situation, October 7th to now?
I would say there are two misconceptions. The first misconception is to ask the question, what else could Israel have done after October 7th? That's the first misconception, because there's a question that precedes it. The question that precedes it is, a population has been caged in to a concentration camp for 20 years. And they had no past, no present, no future. Half of that population is children. 80% of that population was expelled from Israel in 1948, and their descendants, they're a refugee population. So before you ask the question, what should Israel have done after October 7th? You should be asking the question, what should the people of Gaza have done after being locked up in the concentration camp for 20 years? What were their options? What were their alternatives? So that, to me, is the first misconception. It's asking the wrong first question. The first question is, what were the people of Gaza supposed to do after being interned, in many cases, because it's a child population, in many cases, from the day they were born in that godforsaken place? And the second misconception is the one that you read every day, and that's what makes propaganda so successful and so insidious, that it's so pervasive, it's everywhere, So you can't even see outside it, above it, below it, you can. That is, they call it the Israel-Hamas war. Everywhere, every media outlet, print, digital, what's called the mainstream media or the legacy media, everybody uses that same title, the Israel-Hamas war. It's not an Israel-Hamas war. It's an Israel-Gaza war. It's a war against the whole population of Gaza. Does it include the combatants, Hamas? Of course. But does it end there? Of course not. When South Africa alleged that a genocide was occurring in Gaza, well, if you target combatants, that's not a genocide. It's because the whole population is being targeted. It's not a Hamas war. It's a war against the whole population of Gaza.
If you could speak to curious, like in good faith Israelis, because I think of BTS breaking the silence and how some Israeli soldiers are coming to that realization, like, like this isn't good. What would you tell if you could give a message to Israelis?
First of all, it's a bit of a misnomer. That means to describe something incorrectly. If you read the actual breaking the silence testimonies, what the soldiers witnessed and did, you see very little remorse. Very few soldiers say, oh, what we did was terrible. They're just like on a reality show. They're sitting back and describing, yeah, we blew up all those houses. Yeah, we killed all those people. Yeah, it was all random. Yeah, we used a lunatic amount of force. Yeah, they're not apologetic for it. If you look right now with the polls, only 3% of Israeli Jews, only 3%, believe that Israel is using too much force in Gaza. The population overwhelmingly supports the genocide. So I don't believe, and I don't say it happily, I don't believe you can talk to Israelis now any more than you could have talked to whites in the American South during the Civil Rights Movement. They were dug in, they believed in their system, they thought they were treating the darkies or the coloreds wonderfully. They believed it was all outside agitators who were causing the problem in the South. And they were determined to preserve their system. And there was no amount of talk that was going to convince them or persuade them. Does that mean they were unpersuadable? No, over time, the South is a different place than what it was before the Civil Rights Movement. But would the change have occurred because of persuading people in the South? No, external force had to be applied to force a change in the system. And I don't believe, most Israelis, they don't even think of Palestinians as subhuman. Because, a dog is subhuman. And I think there is more concern for a displaced canine than there is for a displaced Palestinian. If a canine is homeless, some ASPCA will kick in to find a shelter for the dog. There's no shelter for Palestinians. Israel has destroyed 300,000 homes in Gaza, leaving about 1.3 million people homeless. They have no home to go back to. Not only do they don't have a home to go back to, they don't have a street to go back to. They don't have a neighborhood to go back to. They don't have a city to go back to because it's all rubble. You don't know where you lived. They don't know. They have no idea. You can be standing in a place and you could have lived there. They have no idea. It's all gone. I don't think they would treat dogs that way. I don't. So I'm not hard-headed. I'm level-headed about this. I don't believe you can persuade them.
Thank you. I think there was two IDF former soldiers on maybe Democracy Now! A week or so ago, and the woman who did that documentary that's kind of being blocked on some campuses, Israelism. But that's what like came to mind when I asked that question. But in the United States, what can regular people and young people do to help this situation and spread awareness?
I don't think there are any magic formulas. What people are doing now, obviously, it can be tweaked, it can be improved. One hopes that good organization will settle in. One hopes that smart, wise leadership takes the helm of power. But in general, I think young people are doing the right thing. I think what's happening in the college campuses is it's inspiring and it's helpful. So I don't give any lessons, but I do have my opinions, and I've expressed my opinions when I've been in situations with, say, the encampments or speaking to college students about things which I think one of the important things of any movement, like for any individual, is the capacity for self-criticism and self-correction. Whenever I make some sort of error, even around the house, I always file it away. Remember, don't make this mistake again. Don't make this mistake again. I leave, because I've been very tired lately, I leave the gas range open and, the fire alarm. And I say, no, don't make that mistake again. And I file it away. You have to, self-correction, self-criticism. And I think that one of the important things in any political movement, there is of course, among young people, they don't want to hear from past generations who are covered in cobwebs. And I get that. And they think they have the righteousness of youth and the idealism of youth. And that's a good thing. That's why the world changes, because people are hopeful that they can change the world. And when you get older, you become less hopeful about the possibility of changing the world. So that's a good thing. The idealism of youth, the righteousness of youth, but that has to be balanced with the wisdom of those who have been in, have trodden that territory before, and not because they're old and conservative, but because of the capacity for self-criticism and self-correction to say, I think you're making a mistake here. I think it's an error, and here's my reasoning why. You can't just say it's an error, you have to explain why. And you hope the young people, in their enthusiasm and in their righteousness, that they have an ear open and a capacity to say, well, you know what, maybe he has a point. Like, I don't like the slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. I think it's a bad slogan. I know the slogan from the 1960s, the 1970s. It was a bad slogan then, and it's a bad slogan now, because it has too much ambiguity. When you say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, obviously a question arises. Okay, what happens to the Jews in that scenario? And some people will say, well, all it's about is everybody being free, but that's not what the slogan says. So I have, in recent weeks, I have voiced my concern that it's a bad slogan. And I said, just change it, tweak it. From the river to the sea, one person, one vote, Palestinians will be free. And you can't answer that slogan, because all you're talking about is equal rights for everyone. From the river to the sea, one person, one vote, Palestinians will be free. And I've encountered resistance. Young people don't like what I'm saying, and I don't really care. My job is not to be, obviously I support the cause, but there's a difference between supporting a cause and being a blind cheerleader. I don't think that's helpful. I spent the whole of my adult life studying the conflict. I've thought intensively about the conflict, and I'm not trying to impose my view on anyone. I'm just saying, this is my opinion, and this is why, and think about it. Now, a lot of folks say, well, that makes me a liberal Zionist, and it dampens the enthusiasm because they love that slogan, because that slogan is so defiant. It's one of those that you can call in-your-face slogans. Yes, that's all true, and I can understand the enthusiasm, but it's not a good slogan because you want to reach people. And if you want to reach people, why should you give them an easy out? By saying, you see, they want to kill, they want to sweep away all the Jewish people, they want to destroy Israel, they want to, no. Why give them that easy out? So that's how I perceive my role right now.
Are there some resources that you do recommend for young people?
You know, it depends on the age, and it depends on the capacity for concentration, the attention span, as it's called. I would say there are some programs which I would recommend. I think Brianna Joy Gray has been a real highlight. I think Crystal Ball has been wonderful. I think Katie Halper has been excellent. I think Aaron Mate has been wonderful. There are a lot of what are called, you know, progressive left-wing podcasters who have been doing great work, and you learn a lot. They do their homework. It's not just shouting or just playing videos, YouTube's. It's serious stuff. So I would recommend them.
Looking back at your life and all the work that you've done, what would you say that you're most proud of?
Easy answer. I stayed true to my youthful beliefs. I think they were correct. Obviously, in details, I got a lot wrong. I was a Maoist. I think that the transformation of China in the 20th century is probably going to be the only event of the 20th century that's going to be remembered. There was something spectacular that happened in China. In my generation, China was called the sick man of Asia. And there were only two images of China. One was the Chinese rickshaw, pulling the rickshaw for the British gentleman. That was a very vivid image. Back bent and pulling the rickshaw for the British gentleman, okay? And the other image was famine. China was synonymous with famine, okay? And now the 21st century, China's the cutting edge of world capitalism. Will overtake the United States if the United States doesn't destroy it, which is a realistic possibility. So I was wrong because I thought the Chinese Revolution was the cutting edge of world communism. Turned out to be the cutting edge of world capitalism. That's not a small error. But on the other hand, the promise of the Chinese Revolution to transform the population such that China has pulled 800 million people out of what's called extreme poverty. That's quite a significant achievement. So I could get details wrong, but my belief that the world is fundamentally wrong and we have to fight to transform it, and the belief that something better is possible, something fundamentally better is possible. I'm the only one who held on to my beliefs. All my friends, they said, you know, who was the age cohort that was least supportive of Bernie Sanders? It was the baby boomers. He could never get more than like 13% of the vote among the baby boomers, okay? The 60s generation. I worked for Bernie Sanders' campaign. I stayed true to my beliefs, and I'm proud of that. Those were very important years in my life, filled with idealism, filled with hope, and filled with the fighting spirit. And I obviously, I made errors. There were course corrections. As a kid, I chanted from the river to the sea, you know. So I had to make errors, but I stayed true to the values of my youth. And those are the people I respect. All of my heroes, they died with the beliefs, the fundamental beliefs that they started out with. Whether it was a Karl Marx, who famously said, "Come hail or high water, I will not let the bourgeoisie turn me into a money-making machine." Whether it was a Rosa Luxemburg, who said, "When I die, I wanted to be either in prison, in a street fight, or at my post." And that's how she died. She was killed in the street fight. Whether it be a Paul Sweezy, the great American Marxist economist who was a mentor of mine, or whether it was Paul Robeson or W.E.B. Du Bois, who till the last day they paid the price but stayed true to their beliefs. And they inspired me. And that to me is the test. It's a test of time. Sure, you're going to make errors and you have to correct them. But the fundamental beliefs were correct, in my opinion. The belief that this system is wretched, it's much more wretched now than it was back then, and that a better world, it's not a certainty. In that generation, it was viewed as a certainty, namely, the capitalism was going to collapse, socialist revolution was inevitable. It was programmed into the system that it had to collapse and socialism had to replace it. The belief in that historical inevitability, no, it's no longer there. There's no sense of we are agents of inevitable historic change, but the possibility remains. You never know. I can't say with certainty, but I still maintain the possibility that a better world is possible and that it's worth fighting for.
What do you hope people remember about you and your work?
They won't remember me. That's one of the sobering facts about life. And you're just like a grain of sand in the Sahara after you pass. If I had kids, yeah, they would remember me. And maybe grandchildren would remember me. But in general, I won't be remembered. And that's just life. You can't change that. Is it important? Well, I'm an atheist, so dead is dead. It's not going to change what I decided to do with my life and what I will do with the rest of my life. That's just a sobering fact of life. I remember reading in sophomore year of high school. I cannot remember. It may have been. I don't remember. Do you know poem Ozymandias? Ozymandias. It's about a great leader who thinks he's immortal, and then somebody stumbles on his statue and it's decaying. Of course, he's completely forgotten. I think that's the fate of 99% of humanity. Chomsky will be remembered, in my opinion. Maybe a half dozen other people will be remembered, and the rest of us, we're fated to just be grains of sand in the Sahara. Look, life's a mystery, and how people resolve for themselves that mystery is for each to decide. I don't have an answer to that mystery called life. That's why, even though Comrade Lenin said to be a communist, you have to be a militant atheist, I don't really agree with that, because if people find religion a mode to negotiate life, trying to find meaning in it, trying to find purpose in it, who am I to say they shouldn't? There's no answer to the mystery of life. There isn't. So each of us contrives a mode to try to make sense of this mystery. And I don't think one mode is better than another. Of course, you would want people to be informed by values that are more generous